Welcome to the Wheel Is Podcast. We're going to put on a great show today. We have a special guest, Dr. Anthony Dixon. We're going to cover a great deal of topics considering American studies, Black, Indigenous American studies from the root. So, like I do, I like to really jump into things, So we're gonna jump right into it. Anthony Dixon, welcome to the Real Is Podcast, great sir.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
That's beautiful. That's wonderful. I want you to speak up because I want to make sure we ain't on the. So we got to give it to give it to everybody straight. We got to give it to them from the root. We got to give it to them how we see it. So I would like to take this time to ask you a few questions. What got you into American Indigenous Studies?
Well, it's like I was just telling some people yesterday, and they asked me about what would I tell young people and doing research and young students. And the thing is, when you do research, going down rabbit holes is what you should look at doing. It's what you should keep in mind. Now you may find some things and you may put it away or take notes and come back to it later.
Sure.
But you go down those rabbit holes. And so I was looking at research way back as a grad student in 2000, looking at resistance to slavery and oppression. And so I came across this remarkable story of the Black Seminoles and the Gullah people and indigenous blacks. And first I uncovered that this was the first Underground Railroad. People created the first Underground Railroad on their own volition, that they didn't need whites to help them like they like to
portray
going north, because they were so heavily involved. But the one going south into La Florida was done by blacks, all on their own volition, And so in doing so, excuse me.
No issues.
In doing so, I started going down these different rabbit holes.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And so I got into Gullah and doing the cultural understanding and historical understanding of Gullah people. And I ended up being a commissioner on the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor Commission.
Yes, sir.
Which is the only heritage area in the United States dedicated to blacks. And so I was there, went down that hole, so to speak.
Sure.
I was on the commission for 10 years. My last year as a chair. And so keep digging though, right?
Yes,
Don't
sir.
stop there. I did this resistance and looking at the history and looking at this first Underground Railroad. And then I uncovered, right, that there truly were indigenous black melanated people here in this hemisphere. And we rely on, initially, people on the English, but the English records only go back so far as well.
Spanish records.
You have to go to the Spanish records.
Oh, man.
You have to go to the Spanish records. And in the Spanish records, you see descriptions of these indigenous people. And one that stands out the most is the word Swarthy.
Dark
we all
complected.
mean dark complexion. And so started going down that rabbit hole more recently, because from the Gullah, I went back, concentrated, of course, on the Black Seminoles themselves and looking at their history from, their Gullah, indigenous, and enslaved runaway heritage
Yes.
to the wars. And the second, historically, another thing why you have to keep digging, because the annals and the history books now call it the Second Seminole War. But the general himself, Thomas Jessup, he writes back to DC, to the Secretary of War, ultimately the president, who, of course, chief of the military, and says this is not an Indian war.
It's a Negro
This is a
war.
Negro war.
Yes, sir.
And so understanding, when you look at it from, I started looking at it from that perspective and started doing the analysis of what makes up a rebellion, right? And there are basically three types. There's the opportunistic, there's the situational.
Situationalist.
Something happens that day. That enslaved person didn't get up that morning with the idea of rebellion, but something happened and it caused them to rebel, and others joined with that, that spark, so to speak.
Yes, sir.
So we call that one situation, where there's this overall idea of overthrowing
Brute force.
enslavement altogether. And those are the three types of rebellions. We have examples of each. Most famous one that we all hear about, of course, is Nat Turner.
Yes, sir.
But, excuse me, Nat Turner's rebellion, technically, and when we look at it, he was rebelling against the plantation society and the slaveholders of Southampton County, Virginia.
Yes, sir.
And so it's Denmark Vesey rebellion that we use that as an example of one where they tried to overthrow enslavement altogether.
Right.
And so the Black Seminole and the Second Seminole War, that one in Florida, against re-enslavement and the ideas that we've been free for generations now, since the mid-1600s. And here you are in the 1800s talking about re-enslaving us and our children and grandchildren,
yes, sir,
who have never known enslavement. And so when you look at the core element, creates and constitutes as a rebellion, we understand that the Negro War was indeed a enslaved rebellion and a quote-unquote slave rebellion. And when you look at it it ticks off the marks, then you understand that it was the largest and most successful. And it also incited other ideas as for enslaved people who were trying to get to Florida. But it also sparked the ideas in Washington, D.C. Congressmen, abolitionists were writing and using what was going on with the Negro War. One in particular was a man out of Ohio by the name of Joshua Giddings. And he wrote a book years later, but he was involved in keeping an eye on it. He writes the book years later.
So let's take a
and
pause.
It's called Exiles of Florida.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Let's take a pause there. Now, To your knowledge,
Hmm.
when it comes to classification,
Okay.
those purposes of reclassifying the American Negro, can you run us kind of how that concept came about? Why was it purposeful? Purposeful. Why was it to reclassify
Hmm.
the Black American Indian? And also, we also know that there's a different type of, which is the Native American. So, can you explain to us the specific differences between the two, the reasons why they chose an allegiance to foreigners, knowing they were foreigners? But can you kind of break down that a little bit more elaborate for us? Because this is extremely educational. I think you're doing a phenomenal. You're giving us phenomenal work. This is perfect.